Hello and welcome to Bright Wings, children's books to make the heart soar. I am your host, Charity Hill. The purpose of this conversation is to help mothers and fathers identify books that will liberate their children to embrace truth, goodness, and beauty. Today we're going to be asking, is it possible to write realistic contemporary middle grade fiction with a mainstream publisher and still have content that points middle schoolers to truth, beauty, and goodness? Is it actually possible to tackle tough topics with middle schoolers in a way that's hopeful and virtuous and really important, non-boring? Joining me to show that it is definitely possible, I welcome Claire Swinarski to Bright Wings Children's Books. Claire, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here and talk all things middle grade.
For those of you who have not yet met Claire or her literature, she is the author of multiple books for both kids and adults. Her writings also been featured in the Washington Post, 17, the Milwaukee Magazine, and many other publications. She lives in a small town in Wisconsin with her husband and 3 kids, where she writes books, wears babies, and wrangles bread dough. So it sounds like a great life, Claire. So congratulations on a beautiful life, Claire.
Thanks. It's pretty dreamy. I mean, in Wisconsin in January is not like the most fun. That's probably the hardest part of life right now is like, we can't ever go outside. My poor kid has had recess indoors since they came back from winter break. So yeah, it's that. Yeah, it's a pretty great life I got going on.
You've published 2 books. What Happens Next, right? About a girl named Abby McCourt. And then recently you've got one that's just been published, right? Called The Kate in Between.
Yes, it came out in May of last year.
Okay. And set out in paperback yet?
Nope, not quite yet. Usually around that year mark, it'll be out in paperback.
Okay. Okay. I can only find it in hardcover and audio. One of the things that is so interesting to me about you, Claire, is that it seems like one of your biggest interests as a writer of middle grade fiction is that you're not necessarily preaching to the choir. You're writing for just the regular girl out there in middle school, right?
Yeah, that's what I try to do. I mean, those are the books that I grew up reading. I grew up reading everything, but I specifically really loved contemporary, realistic middle grade. And so I always kind of knew that was going to be what I wrote. I was never super into like fantasy or adventure. I liked historical fiction and contemporary fiction. So I kind of knew that was going to be my lane.
Okay. So a question I asked at the beginning, that is it possible to write realistic contemporary middle grade fiction with a mainstream publisher? You're published with HarperCollins, and you have a desire to point middle schoolers to lasting things, to meaningful things.
Absolutely. I mean, that's really why I write at the end of the day is I want to point kids to the true, good, and beautiful. And I don't think you necessarily have a faith perspective to do that. You certainly can, but I just have always felt this really strong calling to be in this space, this secular fiction space. I'm a very spiritual person. I run the Catholic Feminist, which is like a online newsletter. And I think a lot of times people think they're going to find my children's books in like the Catholic section of the bookstore, or that they're going to be about saints, but they're really not. They're truly secular fiction that I try to use to point people towards hope and beauty. And I think you can do it. I think it's hard. I think it's hard in a craft sense, and that it's hard to do well. And I'm always trying to get better in that sense. I certainly am not like handing myself a Pulitzer or anything, but I also think it is hard in the sense of where the culture is right now. I think you kind of have to know how you're operating in that space.
Yeah. Well, I think too, I mean, perhaps if you were actually from an explicit faith perspective, you might have a smaller audience, and you might not actually be reaching the audience that you intend to reach, which is girls who need meaning, girls who need truth, girls who need to be pointed to things that are lasting. You might not actually reach that audience because if you were writing from an explicit faith perspective, perhaps you would only get people who already think the way you do.
Right, because then you're probably not going to get in a public school library. You're probably not going to get much press coverage, those kinds of things, which seem kind of meaningless in some ways. But like you said, those are the audiences that I'm trying to reach. I mean, kids are getting so much messaging these days. Every adult has an agenda, including you and me. You know, our agenda might be a good one, but we have one. And helping these kids who are getting these kind of more mainstream messages filter through and find a story that can just resonate with their heart. I mean, that's something that I'm incredibly passionate about. My husband is obsessed with Lord of the Rings, and I'm reading it right now basically as like a bonding experience with him. I'm sorry, all you Tolkien fans, it's a little tricky for me. That man can describe a mountain for like 6 pages. But one thing I do love about him is the way that, you know, you could read that story and walk away being like, that's a secular story. That just, you know, it's not talking about God. It's not talking about eternal heaven or anything like that. But there's so much truth and goodness and beauty in it. I mean, I think in that way, he was really a masterful writer. And so I'm not comparing myself to Tolkien, but I am inspired by the way he was able to do that, even if like trolls and magic rings aren't necessarily my favorite topic.
Right. But you make the point that it's possible to not be writing explicitly about matters of revelation and faith and still point to things that are lastingly true and good and beautiful, that you too, like Tolkien, in whatever small way the analogy fits, that you are digging down into the architecture of the human heart and the architecture of reality to point out things that are lasting to girls that have perhaps nobody telling them, nobody pointing to, let's say, the truth about friendship, which is what the book, The Kate in Between, seems to be about.
Yeah. The
identity
also touches a lot
moral
on
action. It's actually also a book about moral action, like that our choices shape us.
Yes. Yeah. The Kate in Between also really touches a lot on forgiveness. And that was just a really important topic to me. How do we forgive ourselves? How do we forgive other people? What needs to happen in order for someone to earn your forgiveness? Like those kind of things are just really interesting to me, especially, you know, like we're saying in today's current culture, forgiveness is not really looked at in what I would think of as a true sense. I think that it's been really maligned, it's been misunderstood. And so creating a space for girls to be able to really wrestle through that idea in their heads and hearts. I mean, I know the word safe space is really overused, but books in a lot of ways are a safe space. You know, it's something that you can take and think with and walk through and use it to really consider these big, weighty topics, because kids need to be thinking about things like that. I mean, every single human being is going to encounter forgiveness and choices, and to be able to kind of pull that from, I don't know, like the treasury of the stories that they've heard and been like, well, you know, what did Kate do in this situation? That can really help kids. I mean, that really helped me growing up, and it really helps me to this day.
Yeah. I want to return to talking about forgiveness, because it seems like it actually plays an important role in both stories, in the maturation of both characters. So I'm glad I picked up on that, because it's important to you too. I'm glad I'm noticing at least what's important. So let's come back later and talk about forgiveness again. But can we talk about, I noticed that both books open in a similar way. So in What Happens Next, Abby, the main character, says really explicitly, she admits from the beginning to the reader that she's a liar. And then in The Kate in Between, it's a very interesting technique, Claire.
Yeah.
She admits right away that she's the villain of the story.
Yes.
And it's kind of neat that you did this. And I want to ask you why you did it. First of all, for me, I felt like it's a neat signature thing for you to do. Like if you wrote 4 more books and they each kind of open this way, it would be like your thing. I like that you did it twice. And I like, you know, I think it creates kind of this feeling that the character admits right away that they're flawed, and the reader learns this up front right away. And it creates this feeling of authenticity. The main character is just talking to us right away and being totally honest about in the way that she's telling her story. And so somehow we trust her, don't we? Because she admits that she's flawed to us. And so somehow we trust someone who's being honest in that way.
We do, but should we? I don't know. Like, I love an unreliable narrator. I've always loved that trope. Reading, I just remember reading like Catcher in the Rye, and any book where you're not really sure if the main character is on your side or not. That's always been really interesting to me. And I think also, you know, when you're reading a middle grade book, you're so much in the head of that character. You're so much in their spirit. They're telling you things that they wouldn't tell anyone else. And I really did feel like a villain a lot of the time in middle school. You know, I was making a lot of choices that were not great. And that probably is how I, looking back, would identify myself. I think a lot of people could write stories in which I am portrayed as the villain. And that was just a really interesting perspective to me, especially, you know, in the world. We love a good guy and a bad guy. We love a box, a hero and a villain. I like to kind of shake that up because, you know, are there stories where that makes sense? Yeah. Look at Lord of the Rings. There is a hero, there is a villain. It's very cut and dry, and that works for that. But when you're writing a contemporary fiction,
but look at Frodo, look at the way the ring starts to deteriorate his interiority, right? It starts to corrode him. Sorry. Yes. But yeah. Yes.
No, you're good. I'm only on book 2. So I think, you know, looking around at our world, we really want to paint people as the good guys and the bad guys. And that's just not realistic. That's just not how people are. We all have good choices and bad choices. We all have urges that point us upwards and urges that will lead us astray. And it really comes down to how you play into those in different scenarios. And so I was especially really inspired with The Kate in Between in terms of technology. Technology plays a huge part in that story. Kids on smartphones, it's a whole thing in that book. And yeah, it's been really interesting to me how these viral videos have been going around, you know, that really hasn't been around that long. We think it has because we're so used to our iPhones now and Twitter, but this is kind of a new phenomenon that these little snippets of video would just go so bananas, and suddenly anyone on the internet knows who you are and they probably hate you. So I wanted to kind of play from that angle. You know, what's the rest of that person's life like? I doubt that 18 seconds of footage was the best thing they've ever done or the worst thing they've ever done. They're probably a whole person behind that. And so that was really kind of where The Kate in Between started, is me seeing all of these viral incidents and thinking, what's going on behind this? What's going on in that person's heart? And then how are they going to recover from that? I read a book called So You've Been Publicly Shamed by John Ronson. It is fascinating if you're interested in like our current media landscape. And he interviews people who have been like doxxed and canceled online. And just the way that that affects a human spirit is so bananas to me. Like, I couldn't not write about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially in middle school, where you just have this growing sense of growing into a more adult identity, where you realize you don't belong to yourself or your family only. You're belonging to this wider community, and you're opening yourself up to being shaped by the opinions and the structure of your wider social community. I think it's the Kate in Between story is really an interesting exploration of how, of social media. So it's definitely one of the most contemporary middle grade fiction works I've read. Maybe ever.
Very contemporary.
I wrote down a quote from The Kate in Between where she says, people aren't one-dimensional. You want people to be just one thing, the thing that they are to you, but they're not. They're so much more. We are complex creatures, and knowing that simple fact is enough to break your heart. Can you tell us a little bit about Kate? Like, she is between, right? She is neither. Maybe I think she's not quite the villain that she says she is in the beginning. I think she's being a little dramatic. But she's not angelically good. She's not as good as she wants to be either.
Correct. I think that's, I mean, really, that's something in every human heart, but especially in middle school when you're really figuring out, who am I? What do I believe? What do I think about things? Who do I want to surround myself with? it's really hard to walk through that, especially in 2022. I have to imagine when all of it's online. I thank the Lord so often that I was not dealing with this when I was in middle school. And like, I'm not that old here. Okay. I'm 30. I'm not like ancient, but we did not have this in middle school. I was one of the first ones of my friend group to get a cell phone, period. Like no fancy bells and whistles. And I just think that when you're that age and you're trying to make these decisions, everything feels so monumental. Like every whisper just feels like a scream. Every uninvitation feels like, okay, well, that's it. My life is over now. There's nowhere to go. And so she is, prone to those kind of dramatic statements. But I think specifically in her situation, she's looking around at who the role models are that she's been given. Kate has very imperfect parents, which we can touch on later in terms of like writing an imperfect family structure in a way that tries to be virtuous. But she's looking at who she's surrounding herself with, who she's spending time with, and how those people are influencing her. And is she gonna make decisions that make those people happy, or is she gonna make decisions that she thinks are the right one? I mean, she kind of settles in between that somewhere, hence the name. But I think if you finish a book and you think that any character was perfect, that author probably didn't do a great job, because no characters are perfect.
Well, and we want to see a character grow, right? It's a boring book if the character is confronted with a problem and they don't grow. I mean, that there isn't a book published, I think.
Right. Well, there are, but there just aren't very good. I mean, there's a lot of very like cheesy Christian books where it's like, this was clearly written as like a PowerPoint presentation, and someone was like, let's try to make a fiction story about it. And it's just very shallow and there's nothing to really wrestle with. It's just like medicine almost. Like, here, take this Tylenol. Like, this is the answer to the problem. Versus what books should be, which I think is conversation starters. They should make you think. They shouldn't necessarily be easy to digest and figure out.
Can you tell us about The Kate in Between, just so the listeners know the basic plot structure of it?
Sure. So The Kate in Between is about 12-year-old Kate. She just moved in with her dad. Her parents are broken up. And she is a girl who is going through some real tricky social dynamics. She recently kind of ditched her lifelong best friend to hang with the more popular crew. They kind of invited her into her circle and she accepted that invitation. And so she really left her lifelong best friend kind of in the dust. And then that best friend ends up getting into a dangerous situation one day, and Kate saves her life. And that small segment of Kate doing that gets filmed and goes viral. And so suddenly you've got the whole world looking at Kate being like, oh, she's such a hero. She's Kate the Great. But Kate is really wrestling with the truth, which is that she's not even friends with that girl anymore. She's actually been pretty cruel to her over the past year. And so while she's being put up on this pedestal, she's wrestling with the truth of who she is, which is someone who's made quite a few mistakes this past year. And so she kind of walks through that and lives through the fallout of going viral. And yeah, it's a book that was really a joy to write. And it was also a little tricky in terms of like, I had to pump my 12 and 13-year-old babysitters for information on like, what social media platforms are kids on? Like, I don't even really know anymore. Like, what are the kids wearing these days? It was really fun to do that research for it.
One thing that I found really great about the way you wrote this book is that Kate's really thinking through both sides of this. She's really thinking about what is friendship. She asks, what's a best friend? What do those words even mean? What's great about the fact that Kate is flawed is it allows the very kids you're trying to reach tap into some of Kate's exploration of this. So, she asks, what does it even mean, a best friend? It doesn't mean it's not the friend I've known the longest, not the friend I trusted, not even the friend who made me laugh. Is it someone to take selfies with? Somebody to partner up with in lab?
someone to sit with at lunch. And then she names this one girl Violet. Was Violet my best friend? I didn't even like her. And she laughs. But I love that Kate kind of has to sort through, like, what is my attraction to Taylor, the super popular girl? Why do I like her? Like, yes, sometimes she's nice. Sometimes she makes me feel actually really special. She makes me feel chosen.
Yeah. And I mean, this is why I still read middle grade books, and I tell adults to read good middle grade, because I'm like, man, in some ways, this is a problem for middle schoolers. And in some ways, aren't every single one of us trying to figure out what is a friend? You know, how do friends act? You get used to spending time with people, and then all of a sudden you're like, wait, are we even like aligned? Like, do I even enjoy spending time with you, or am I just kind of used to it? I think those are like age-old questions, man. But in middle school, when you're in school all day, it just hits you extra. I mean, unless you're homeschooled, but even then you've got homeschool co-ops and all that good stuff, I'm sure. My kids are public schoolers, so they're with their friends all day. And I was a public school kid. So it's like, when you're with someone for 8 hours a day, they're going to have a huge amount of influence on you. And I can look at pictures of myself and my friends from middle school, and it's like, yeah, some of you, I really didn't even like why was I hanging out with you all the time? Like, I didn't think you were funny, and I didn't agree with you on that much, but there's something about certain people that just kind of draws you to them. I don't know how to really like define popularity, but there's just something about some charismatic people that makes you want to be in their space. And I think that that's how Kate feels about Taylor, who is very much the mean girl of the school, and also very much walking through her own journey, which you'll see if you read the book. I mean, Taylor's not one-dimensional either. So
it's interesting that neither she nor Taylor actually get into anything very meaningful with each other. Mm-hmm. It's just mostly they bond over criticizing other people a lot. Whether it's friends within the group or whatever. But both their moms are absent. And one of the things that Kate admits to is that things seem really fun and special with Taylor. And at the same time, Kate gets to hide from anything that's too personal or too painful, which she wouldn't be able to hide from with her friend Hattie, because Hattie has known her so long. Hattie knows the truth about her. And I think you're pretty explicit a couple of times that Kate really kind of wants to avoid being really loved and being really known.
Right.
Isn't that funny that we do that?
Yes. I was just going to say, I think people of all ages do that too. You know, who are the people who you're the most vulnerable with and the most intimate with? Sometimes when hard things happen in your life, those actually aren't the people that you want to be around, because it's so much easier to just hide. And you know what I mean? Like, just people that we can just be kind of light with. And there's nothing wrong with having casual friends either, but it's when we start to avoid our friends who we can be more intimate and vulnerable with that we get into trouble, which Kate finds out, because then when things go wrong in her life, you know, who does she have to turn to? It gets a lot trickier.
Can we go back and now talk about forgiveness?
Sure. Yeah.
So interested to know why you used forgiveness as a way to mature your characters. What does forgiveness do?
Yeah. For me personally, forgiveness is like the virtue that makes the world go round. If we don't have it, we're going to suffer really badly, because all human beings are flawed and all human beings hurt each other. It's human nature. People you love really deeply hurt you. People who are really good people hurt you. And if we lose that forgiveness as a society, man, we're going to see some consequences. And I think that we are seeing that. I think we're seeing that in the world right now. What happens when we take people who have made mistakes and really turn them into villains and stop seeing people as three-dimensional people? And I think how that comes out in the Kate in between is, you know, it's not just forgiving people who have done really terrible things to each other, but also finding a way to forgive yourself. Kate's made a lot of mistakes in her life, and she continues to do so, but finding a way for her to be able to say, like, I'm more than that worst thing that I ever did, is so vital. And I think that's really a message that middle graders need, is that you are not just the worst mistake that you made. You're not just that mean look you gave to somebody. You're not just that mean prank you played. And I mean, I'm a believer. So I think that you're a divine creature of God. I think that you are intimately loved forever. And so I don't explicitly say that in the book, but.
Well, I think you allude to it when the character says, hurting people hurt people and loved people love people. Hattie, who's such a strong character, forgives Kate, and that in turn liberates Kate.
Tapping kind of into that sense of that we are good beings is something that I don't really see a lot of in most middle. I mean, I got plenty of feedback that was like, Kate sucks. Like, I don't want to read about a character who's this cruel to people. But I think that that's just the reality of what life is like. We're just broken, fallen beings. And so I think forgiveness is being able to say, you did something hurtful and you made a mistake, but I know your identity. Your identity is a child of God, and you are so much more than what you've done. And I also don't even think people necessarily have to apologize to you for you to give that forgiveness. I'm not saying you walk back and now be their best friend. And again, if you read the book, you'll see kind of where Kate lines up with Hattie and Taylor. And I'm not saying that you just have no boundaries, like let people in and treat you however they want. But forgiveness is really something internal that you can offer to people. And if you don't, I mean, I always butcher quotes, but somebody somewhere said that like refusing to forgive is like drinking poison and hoping it kills the other person. And I think that is truly what we're seeing in a lot of society today. And so I want to give kids the opposite message. I don't want to tell kids that there's like villains lurking around every corner. I want to show kids how to behave when someone you love hurts you deeply.
Right. What if, I mean, we don't want to, our young people need a message, not that you make this mistake and you're canceled permanently.
Yes. Yeah.
That's
and that
it
you
for you.
Cancel other people.
Your life
that,
is over, just like you're afraid.
Yes,
it is. It seems like too, forgiveness gives you back the opportunity to begin again, to be the person that you always were, or to be the person that you intend to be and want to be. It's to kind of give back the truth of the original identity, your original dignity. And if you don't forgive, like you said, that quote, to drink poison and to hope that the other person dies, like you really, if you don't forgive, I guess you're bound, you're kind of bound, you're tied up.
I love that. I've never heard that, but I love that. Forgiveness is giving someone back the truth of who they are. I love that. You're very deep today.
Thank you. Well, I just think too with Kate, I have to say, I don't love her. Claire, I don't like her particularly. But that's okay. I mean, she makes me uncomfortable, but that's okay. That's the point. Because I don't necessarily like her choices or respect her choices. I was pretty frustrated at her lack of integrity. Like, here I'm friends with Hattie and I want to be friends with Hattie and I love how I feel around Hattie. And then the next scene, she's making some cutting remark to Taylor about Hattie, or agreeing with Taylor's cutting remark about Hattie.
Yeah.
But how is she going to change? Right. I mean, she's realizing these things about herself. She's really having these moments of self-realization, and there has to be some way in which she can say, I have made a mistake. I do want to be different and I want to move on and be the person that I want to be. So it seems like forgiveness is necessary if that character is actually going to move forward.
Right. And I mean, you'd hope that she would take whatever lessons she learns in this whole debacle and walk with them for the rest of her life. And I mean, that's the beauty of middle grade literature, that they can kind of encounter these stories without having to be the person who goes viral or having to be the person who they can see the consequences of a mistake without making it themselves. In a way that's like enjoyable and entertaining and not like a boring school assembly or something. I write what I write to point middle schoolers towards truth. That's what I usually have in the front of my mind. I don't know why the word help makes me feel like I'm like holding their hand and walking them through it. Yeah. It's more like I want to provide like an enjoyable tool for them to point them somewhere, but also just entertain them. I mean, I love to read. I think that you start your lifelong habit of reading, hopefully when you're a kid, and it just never goes away. It's harder to get into it as an adult if you weren't into it as a kid. So also I'm just trying to, entertain them.
So your intention as a writer is to kind of break open a topic in a way that allows you to talk about the things that you love, and but you can talk about them in a way that suits the place that middle schoolers live.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something that is written in their language and in their culture, and something that they can see themselves in.
What do you remember reading in middle school that was important to you? Was there a favorite book? Was there a bad book you read?
So much in middle school. My mom was a 5th grade teacher. And so my whole life, it was just books, constantly. When I was in middle school, my favorite books, well, I'll give a few. I've always loved the author Sharon Creech. So anything by Sharon Creech, I was all over. I loved The Wanderer, was one of my I have like my old copy on my bookshelf. I love Sharon Creech so much. And I was also a classic Judy Blume girl. Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret is like actually a super deep book about religion. If you reread it as an adult, you're like, whoa, I didn't see all this stuff in here when I was a kid. I thought it was about like bras, but that's a great winner. What were some of my other favorite middle school books? Another book series that I really loved that you're going to be like, oh my gosh, are you serious? But I have to just acknowledge them for what they are, is that I loved The Babysitter's Club. I read so much Babysitter's Club, and my mom was sometimes eye-rolly about it, a little judgy. We're at the library and I'm just getting like 7 Babysitter's Club books. But I am a big believer in giving kids some freedom over what they read, and how that helps them fall in love with reading. And so was the Babysitter's Club like high literature? Absolutely not. But did Babysitter's Club help me become a lifelong reader? I honestly believe that. Don't watch the Netflix series. It's terrible. But the books are actually a huge part of my childhood. So I loved the Babysitter's Club. And I didn't read a lot of fantasy, but I do have to give a shout out to Ella Enchanted. That was another favorite that I read over and over and over. And Maniac Magee. I don't know how I forgot that one. That was probably like my all-time favorite book for years. Maniac Magee is a great one about race and friendship and what it means to be family. And that's just a great classic. In terms of a bad book, I honestly don't even remember the title, which is probably good. So I'm not like publicly shaming anyone, which I said I didn't want to do. But I do remember I read this book that was it was like a Christian fiction book. And I think this started me on the, like, this is why I'm not going to write like explicitly find it in the Catholic section fiction. I'm sure there's some really great Christian and Catholic fiction. I don't mean to paint with a broad brush, but I read a book.
Let's be honest. The big endeavor is to make artistically good art.
Yes.
Right? Like first.
Yeah. Right.
It needs to be what it is.
And I just feel like it's lacking in a certain area. I read this book in middle school, and I just remember it was about a girl who liked a boy, and then she like kissed him and got in huge trouble. And then at the end, there was like an altar call at her church where she went up and like got forgiveness from all these people for like kissing her crush. And I'm like, this is so weird. Like, also I'm Catholic, we don't do altar calls. So I had no idea what was going on. B, like, this is just clearly written to be like, purity is great, everything else is terrible. That's obviously the only reason that this book was written. And C, it was just written really terribly with like stiff dialogue and no plot. So I can't remember what it's called, and that's good because I don't want you to read it because it was so bad. But yes, that was like probably one of the worst books I've ever written. And I just think about it a lot when I'm writing to remind myself not to write so like transparently of like, this is the message that I want you to get out, all capitals. Like, I want to write books that make you think, not books that just hand you my opinion on something. Like, who cares about my opinion, to be honest? I want people to know how to think and have conversations with their family and their friends and the people they interact with. And
Actually, I read a ton of Babysitter's Club in 5th grade. There was a reading
Yes.
contest that my teacher hosted, in which every time you read a book, you would cut out a construction paper foot and write your name on it and the title of the book that you read and put it up around the room. And guess who won? Yeah.
Nice.
Me. Because I was like speed reading Babysitter's Club book, like one a day.
I love it.
People thought I was cheating.
I mean, you can easily read a Babysitter's Club book in a day. They are not like hefty literature. But Sarah Mackenzie at Read Aloud Revival has given a lot of times the metaphor of like your literary feast and how you need like the meat and potatoes, you need the vegetables, and like you need some cotton candy in moderation. It's fine. And so I'm like, yeah, you know what? I love Babysitter's Club. And when we go to the library, I try to get my kids some great, beautiful picture books we can read aloud together. Also, we always leave with at least one PJ Masks, Pikachu, Star Wars thing.
Garbage.
And I'm like, whatever. They wanted to pick it. It's not like immoral. It's not going to like lead them astray. They just want to read about Pikachu before bed. Fine. Like that's going to make them love books. I want books to be something that brings them joy, and that's going to help. So
no, I think it's important to be, it can be easy to be rigid, either all one way or all another.
Yes.
Like I'm only going to let my kids, my children are always going to pick all their own books,
And not to let them is to be oppressive.
or it's easy to be like, I am always going to only pick all of my children's books for them. So I think it's easy to be rigid one way or another about it. I feel like my role though is to always that's my purpose in this podcast, is to constantly ask people to continue to pursue things that are lasting and deeper. So I tend to eschew
some of the fluffier things because it's so easy to find fluff. It's so ubiquitously available. And then I think really fluffy books, those cotton candy books, I actually think that they're not satisfying. I don't feel like they give us the buzz that we actually even really want. They might be kind of happy and they might give us a temporary feeling of having our curiosity satisfied or participating in something going on socially. But I just think they might spark a lifelong love of reading insofar as we feel like we can read them. That's good. They're not going to spark a lifelong love of reading because they spark joy.
Because I'm trying. That's one of my things, is to try to, it's just so widely available that I'm always asking us to return to things that are lasting. So, but at the same time, I did learn things from Babysitter's Club. I did, I got some notion of what it was like to be a bunch of girls who organized themselves. And I hosted my own clubs of different kinds. They were book clubs. Where we like role played Anne of Green Gables or something. Don't tell anyone. It's really embarrassing now.
Okay, what's more embarrassing is I have never read Anne of Green Gables. And I think I am, first of all, the only person. Second of all, definitely the only like Christian woman in the entire world who has never read Anne of Green Gables. I don't know. They never like called to me. I'm going to have to try it when my daughter is old enough for them. Maybe I'll like wait and we'll do it together. And then perhaps
they're still really worthwhile as a grown woman.
Yeah.
I also really liked the Emily books, which is about a writer. You might just start with the Emily books, Claire.
Is it the same author?
Same author. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's a trilogy.
Okay. I'll have to look into it.
Yeah. But, I also learned how to hide candy, like Claudia, from the Babysitter's Club in my room, but which my friends loved. But it did teach me about sort of some problem solving and some friendship, and gave me some, ideas outside of my own friend structures about how to be a friend.
The books are benign, the Babysitter's Club. They filled up a lot of time.
Yeah. And there's nothing that bananas in them. They're not like these super immoral books. I think there is one where Christy makes out with her boyfriend, and I specifically remember it. And that's probably like the worst one. You know what I mean? Like they're so, and that's like nothing compared to what's in books today, to be honest. Those are like squeaky clean. Wow. So
That's so funny. Yeah. So Babysitter's Club. I mean, I guess there's a whole bunch of books that you can just call benign books. Although I think there's just such a tremendous amount of writing out there that for me, one of my purposes is zeroing in on like things that are quality and helping us remember that that's what we need to be pursuing as mothers and fathers. Because it's just so easy to find mediocre literature, seems like. And to live kind of an unexamined life, an unreflective life.
Yeah, for sure.
Talking about bad books we read in middle school. I read Gone with the Wind in 8th grade.
Oh, wow. I'm impressed that you read that as an 8th grade. I like watched the movie and was like, I think that's enough for me. I think that I think I've gotten that now.
I mean, so it just, it's interesting because, like what kind of effect did Gone with the Wind have on 8th grade me? Where was the adult that should have been in my life for me to talk about Gone with the Wind? I mean, that's a really thick book. It's like 4 inches thick. It's really thick. And I was reading that for a while. And why didn't any adults in my life ask me about the content of that book? And they should have been like, there should have been somebody who was asking me about that. Like my mom wanted to make sure it wasn't smutty. And it's not. Actually, it's not really it's not a racy book. Like what affected this somewhat? I mean, in some ways it's a good book. In some ways it's a bad book. In some ways it was a bad book for an 8th grade girl. It taught me how to flirt.
Yeah.
It taught
what
me.
What made you want to pick up Gone with the Wind as an 8th grader?
I don't know. Curiosity.
Yeah, I'm just fascinated because I feel like when I was in 8th grade, like I'm trying to think back to. I feel like
probably in the 80s there was like they probably redid the color in it. Of the movie, the coloring in the movie, and that kind of got my attention. And then I don't know how I found a copy of the book at a friend's house.
The Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants was probably my favorite book in 8th grade. So
interesting. I just read that last year or this past year. Yeah. So it's just I think it raised my awareness of feminine power. Gone with the Wind did. Scarlett did. Scarlett's pretty manipulative. She's a master of seeming weak in order to work the system.
Yeah. No,
but she's actually really strong, and she works upon the feelings of men, good men and bad men, just to serve her own survival instincts, whether it's for fun or for food or for protection. She's a little bit of an ugly character, even though she's sort of physically beautiful.
Yeah. But I mean, also not every character has to be like a role model. I don't necessarily think that makes it a bad book. When I'm just thinking about like, yeah, Kate was a jerk in The Kate in Between in some ways. But I like when a book does point you towards hope and doesn't end on like a super depressing, all is lost note. Oh my gosh, I just read another really terrible adult fiction book that I finished and was just like, well, now I feel despair and horror. That's how I feel after reading that book. It's probably not great literature.
Well, yeah, I'm not saying that every character has to be perfect or noble. I do think though that was a book that I should have been talking to somebody about.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That it shouldn't be read in isolation. Yeah, I should have been having a conversation with an adult about Scarlett O'Hara's character, because it's not as if I shouldn't read about flawed characters as an 8th grader. I was very capable of reading about a more morally complex character than Scarlett, for sure. But I should have been having a conversation with, like, a meaningful conversation about the book with some adult. And I wasn't.
Yeah.
So let's talk maybe a little bit about that. So there's kind of a culture out there of protecting versus equipping.
Yeah, I think it's
interesting about that.
Well, I find it fascinating that right now we're kind of, this conversation about like banned books is resurging. I personally am someone who does not really like the idea of banning a book from like a library or something like that. My kids are really little. My oldest is only 5. So I am in control of what books he reads. I mean, I buy the books. He has a library card, but I'm driving him to the library. Like, he doesn't have a way to get books unless they come through me. And when I find books for him, I try to find books that align with our family values, with books that, like you said, point towards things that are lasting. I feel like our kids are going to encounter so many things that we disagree with in the world. They just are. It's 2022, and like they are going to encounter things that don't align with our family's values and the way we choose to live our life. And so I would rather have him confront something like that in a book where we could have a conversation and he still lives at home and he feels comfortable talking to me about things, and we can really converse about how to handle these kinds of things versus just being like, you can't read that. I mean, in some ways it's an age thing. Like, he is 5, so I'm not going to hand him something that he can't handle or that he's not ready for a conversation about. And kids' personalities play into that too. Like, my 5-year-old is super sensitive. My 3-year-old, we say having her is like having 2 kids. She's like the smartest child I've ever known. She's also crazy. So I think kids' personalities play into it a lot too. But, you know, in my books and a lot of other contemporary middle grade, there are things in there that are obviously not how I want my kids to act. The characters make choices that I don't want my kids to make. But if they never see those choices, and like we were talking about earlier, if they never see the consequences of those choices, how is that going to play out when then in real life they're confronted with it? My next book that comes out in January of 2023, the publishing process is so long. I wrote this book like a year ago, but it comes out in a year from now. That book deals with sexual harassment in middle school. And I think that a lot of parents would be tempted to be like, ooh, I don't want that in my house. Because it's about a topic that is ugly and I don't want that under my roof. But sexual harassment absolutely exists in middle school, hands down. I know that from my own experience. I know it from talking to my babysitters. It happens at Catholic schools. It happens at classical schools. It happens at public school. It happens. And so I would much rather give my kids a vocabulary to talk about it, an avenue to start a conversation. Like, hey, I read this book, or about like a way to kind of begin a conversation with me. I want it to be something that they're able to think through before they're in the situation, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so I'm much more on the side of equipping. I mean, there's darkness in the world. Even a book like, there's some historical fiction I grew up reading about World War II. I kind of feel like everyone goes through their like World War II historical fiction phase when they're like a middle schooler or high schooler. Some of that is dark, like really dark. But it happens.
I mean, World War II is this avenue for really confronting ultimate things, isn't it?
Yes.
Right. And no wonder you're going to have that phase of reading in like junior high when your identity, you're like, who am I? Am I good? Am I evil? What is my relationship to the world?
Yes, exactly. And I don't want to have to tell my kids about the Holocaust. I don't want to have to tell my kids about slavery. I wish those things hadn't happened. I don't want to have those conversations, but that's parenting, man. That's what it looks like to raise children, is you have to have tricky conversations about hard things. And again, not when they're 5, probably, or like not in a scenario where a book is painting, those things as good, or a book is really shallow, or, I mean, there's plenty of books being published now where the sexual ethics do not line up with my family's values at all. But even then, I'm not saying that I would prevent my kids from reading them. I would just hope that we could have conversations about it and that they would feel equipped to know what they believe versus what the world believes. Because I mean, my family's values are probably in the minority of the world. They're going to go out to college, they're going to become adults, they're going to get jobs, and they're going to be in the minority. So they need to have a foundation that's rock solid. And I think part of that foundation is reading books and having conversations about them. So I definitely lean more towards the equipping than protecting. But
yeah, can you talk about this book that is going to be dealing with sexual harassment? So I hazard to guess that that people are always meant to be loved and never meant to be used.
Yes. I mean, that's a big question. That is my fundamental understanding of human sexuality, is that people are gifts from God. Sex and sexual acts have a purpose designed by God. They're not ugly, they're beautiful, but they have a purpose that was designed. They're not to be used recklessly or to be used as humor or to be used in ways that hurt people. But in middle school, a lot of the times, yeah.
I was going to say, what's the premise of the story? Is it a peer-to-peer harassment?
Yep. So it's called What Happened to Rachel Riley, and it is about a girl who goes to a new school. She moves to Wisconsin from Chicago, and she learns of a game that the middle school boys are playing that is very disrespectful to the middle school girls, and it involves sexual harassment. And so it's a lot of, what does harassment mean? Like, what is funny versus what is not funny? When do you bring adults in? What can those kind of conversations look like? How should girls protect one another? And it can really probably lead to a lot of big conversations like that, maybe not everyone is ready for. I understand that too. Like, you might have a kid who you don't think personally is ready for that. But if you have a girl in 7th grade, I would be very surprised if she had never witnessed at least anything like what happens in this book happen in school. And I mean, I know that's a little depressing, but it's like, well, we could either curl up in a ball and pretend that that's not true. Like I was saying earlier, like just never talk about slavery and pretend it never happened. Or we could confront the truth of the fact that our culture and, specifically in middle school, where like we keep saying, you're growing, you're figuring out who you are, your body is changing, your hormones are like completely bananas. We could confront the truth of that and really empower girls. Because another issue that I kind of have been consistently seeing is that we're giving girls a lot of victim communication, like a lot about how to look at yourself as a victim and someone's been hurt. And we aren't necessarily also handing them the tools to say, okay, what do you do about that? How do you help solve the problem? How do you walk forward after something bad has happened to you? And yeah, I hope it kind of starts some of those conversations. So it won't be out for quite a while, but it's definitely the heaviest book that I've ever written.
Wow, I'm glad you're writing it, Claire.
Thanks.
It's due out in 2023?
Yes, January 2023. It was supposed to be this fall, but it got pushed back for supply chain problems. Oh. Typical. So yeah. Yeah, but I just saw the final cover and I think I get to share that pretty soon. And it is amazing. I love it so much. So yeah.
Gosh, that's great. Congratulations, Claire.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, like I said, there's a lot. It's not like there's not other books being written about sexual harassment in middle school, but it does kind of come back to like, okay, what's the overall message? Like what do you want kids to get out of it? And again, that doesn't mean having all perfect characters, but that means what is that book pointing towards? Is it pointing towards truth or is it pointing towards a lie? I think that a lot of the times people are afraid of contemporary middle grade books. And I understand that, because if you look at what is being published most frequently, I get that a lot of it is not necessarily virtuous, not necessarily pointing towards things that are lasting, not necessarily even like great literature, to be honest. My fellow authors are probably like want to kill me, but I get it as a mother. That's what I'm trying to say. At the same time, there are really good contemporary middle grade books being written. You've got to know where to look and you've got to have resources. Like what you're doing, this is an amazing resource. I love also the website Redeemed Reader, I think is a great resource. They don't say like, don't read this or read this, but they just kind of tell you, these are the things that are in it. So if your kid is ready for this kind of conversation, great. And if they're not, you make that decision, you're the parent. Going into like a library or bookstore with a resource can be really helpful. But try not to be like afraid of contemporary middle grade, because there really are some good things that are happening. We're seeing more different kinds of stories being told, which is great. More kids are able to see themselves in books. There's more books about people who are all different colors and have all different abilities being written. And I think those things are really important. When I was growing up, it was a lot of white middle class nuclear family books. And there's nothing wrong with that either, but you want all kids to be able to see themselves in books. And so that's a great thing that's happening as well. Can I shout out a couple of recent middle grade books that I think are good?
I was actually going to ask you for a short list, like a yes. 5 to 10.
Yes. So a couple that I really liked recently, one is called The Last Fifth Grade of Emerson Elementary. And it's a book written in poems, which I love. I love a good verse book about a fifth grade class right before their school gets demolished. That book is really good. One of the characters is experiencing homelessness, and it's just a really beautiful book. Another great book is Broken Strings, and it's about a contemporary Jewish girl who learns that her grandfather was in Auschwitz, and it's just an absolutely fascinating look at anti-Semitism, and it's really well written. That's called Broken Strings. Another one that I really love is Song for a Whale. That is about a girl who is deaf, and she makes this connection with this whale who's migrating, and the different like sounds that whales make. It really plays a lot on her inability to hear. And she has a great relationship with her grandparents. That's really fun to read. And Song for a Whale is a really good one. Lynn Kelly actually blurbed The Kate in Between. So I've got a soft spot for her, but I love her book. And then another one is Up for Air by Lori Morrison. That's a great one about a girl who, that's kind of a little heavier, like what my next book. It's about a middle school girl who gets a crush on a high school boy, and the kind of bad dynamics that come out of that. But that could be a great conversation starter. I really wish someone had handed me Up for Air when I was a kid, because that is, I think, more common than we know, like inappropriate crushes and things like that. And then the last one I'll kind of shout out. I know everyone has read Wonder by R.J. Palacio. It's like the most popular middle grade book of all time. But if you haven't read Wonder, about a boy with a facial difference and the new school he goes to, it is so good. You will cry your face off, but also laugh hysterically, and then just want to hug your children, because it is the best book. And it would probably be a great book to also read like with your kid. If you guys could read together, I think Wonder is another great conversation starter. So those are a couple more contemporary ones. Go to the library, check them out. There's nothing bananas in them. They're great to have conversations about. And yeah.
Claire Swinarski, thank you for helping us think through contemporary middle grade fiction and some of its more challenging aspects. This has been a really interesting conversation. I'm really glad that you're writing stories that help our young people to live a more examined life. So.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks for all the work you do. It's really important. And I will keep following along.
Thanks, Claire.